Okay, great. So tonight we're doing part two, but it's not, you could have missed part one. It's not necessarily connected. It's just covering the whole Second Temple era of what life was like, what the destruction was like, and how Judaism just changed vastly with the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash and the temple. So last week we covered that whole story just through the prism of Mishnayot and Halacha, which is a very different way of looking at it. Tonight we're going to look through biblical sources of how did the Nevi'im transcribe the story and how did they tell their story. And we also then have to do some extra biblical sources because the Nevi'im stopped before the destruction of the temple. So we're going to read through some through Josephus and see some really difficult accounts, actually. It's very upsetting. So I'll give you another trigger warning before we get into that. And then we'll also see through text how life changed so much. Just a little bit of intro before we jump into the sources. And again, I did send a source sheet. It is very, very long, which is unlike me because I really try to keep it to one page, even if it's like back to back. But because this is called reliving it through text, we needed to have text to relive it through. But we'll go through it quickly. So the Jews first settled in Canaan in the 13th century BCE, and Jerusalem was not immediately the political or spiritual epicenter. It wasn't until 3 centuries later when Shlomo HaMelech built the actual Beit HaMikdash that it really kind of blossomed. It first became the capital with David HaMelech, with King David. He created the Israelite leadership in Jerusalem, and that's where the religious life was starting to prosper. That's where the prophets would go to tell their tales. And it wasn't until his son Shlomo built the Beit HaMikdash that it was truly the kind of the center of Canaan and center of Israel, of ancient Israel. And it was this thriving economic epicenter and religious epicenter. And it was also in the middle of the country. So it made a lot of sense for the commerce between all the different countries that you kind of had that capital. Shlomo's son Rechavam took over when Shlomo died, and he imposed very large taxes to cover the cost of Shlomo's building fees. He built up Beit HaMikdash, he built up Yerushalayim and a lot of Israel, but that eventually led to the splitting of the kingdom when they had the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, Judea. And so I'm just kind of showing you, we're starting the fraction all the way back, several centuries BCE, where we now have 2 kingdoms in this tiny country of Israel and these people. And in 722, the Assyrian king came and exiled the northern kingdom. So already by 722 BCE, the northern kingdom is exiled. In 586 BCE, the Babylonians destroy the first Beit HaMikdash. They exile much of the Judean population. And it's now in that exile, after, if you reread the horrible stories of Eicha, that's the first Beit HaMikdash, that's when Jews actually start to practice an ancestral tradition that didn't require a temple. For example, that's when they started laning. They started saying, let's get together as Jews and just start reading our scriptures, start reading the Torah together in groups. So you see, like, kind of the fractioning starts earlier. When they get exiled the first time, they start creating practices that can still maintain their Judaism even without a temple, and start setting up what Judaism could look like for the future. What's going to end up being a synagogue, what we have today. In 539, Babylon fell very quickly and drastically by the Persian Empire. And the Jews are suddenly able to return. And we're going to see that in the sources, this kind of surprise, like, you can go back from Cyrus, from the Persian temple. And they're told they can rebuild. And Cyrus, and we'll see the sources, Cyrus even says, take my money. Tell your neighbors to give money. You can rebuild your temple. So they do build the Beit HaMikdash. It's under the Persian Empire, but Israel is a vassal state. In 323 BCE, Alexander the Great of Macedonia, a very ambitious young man, and he has this campaign to conquer Persian territories. And so Israel was one of the places that he conquered, that he was now going to take over. But he didn't leave a will for instructions on what his predecessors would do in terms of dividing up his vast empire. And it happens to be Judea was a prime location for trade and for commerce between all of those different countries. So it was very vulnerable to territorial wars between Alexander's generals that took over his empire. So the Ptolemies, the Seleucids, and the Macedonians were constantly fighting over Judea, and Israel was constantly in the middle of that. The Jewish people were constantly in the middle of that. In 200 BCE, I'm running through this because this is kind of just the background leading up to the Second Temple. In 200 BCE, the Seleucids take over Judea, which is King Antiochus, as we know from the Hanukkah story. He conquers the area. So now the Jews are living under the Syrian Greeks. The social dynamics within the Jewish community are somewhat fraught because there's so many intra-Jewish tensions between different sects of Judaism. The three large sects are the Pharisees. The Pharisees, which is kind of the main Judaism that we continue today, emphasizes the authority of the oral tradition, which complements the written Tanakh. They saw themselves as the inheritors and the interpreters and the transmitters of the tradition. There was also the Sadducees, the Tzaddukim. They reject the authority of the oral tradition, so their Shabbat and Chagim and Kashrut look incredibly different. And then there's the Essenes, who are this mystical Jewish sect. They're much smaller than the other two. They have voluntary poverty, a lot of daily immersion, asceticism. Some of them thought that you should be celibate and not get married. They're very, very different. But there's a lot of this interfighting on how do we inculcate Greek culture into our culture, into the Jewish culture, and the Hellenists and the Hasmonean dynasty. There was just so much interfighting. So this it's not, and we're going to see in the sources, it's not a golden period for the Jewish people. It doesn't show our best side. There's a lot of fighting, there's a lot of intermarriage, there's a lot of questioning of the Jewish faith. In 63 BCE, Rome takes over Judea. The Pompey captures Jerusalem, and they allow free religious practice in Judea. And so that's a lot of just the background, just the historical background of, you see fracturing, you see how the temple kind of comes in and out of this focus of being the center of life, but also having to live without it. The Jews are everywhere, as we'll see, some return and some don't. So that's kind of just the background. I'm going to share my screen and we'll jump into some of these sources. All right, here we go. All right, so we've got Second Temple life during the Second Temple. What was it like? So in the Sefer Ezra, in the book of Ezra, it covers the return to Zion, 538 BCE to 516 BCE. The Babylonian Empire, as we talked about before, has collapsed suddenly. Cyrus the Great of Persia has permitted Jews to return to Israel and rebuild. So let's look at the first few psukim. What is the air? What is the avirah? What's it feel like that Cyrus says, go back and build the Beit HaMikdash? So what's our first reaction here? So Pasuk Aleph, Bishnat Achat Lechoresh, Melech Pras. It's the first year of Cyrus, the king of Persia, because remember, Babylon just fell. Lichlot Davar Hashem mipir Yirmiyah, and the word of Hashem speaks to Yirmiyah, to the prophet Jeremiah. He'ir Hashem et Ruach Koresh Melech Paras. Hashem has awakened the Ruach, the spirit of Cyrus, of Persia, V'ya'aver kol b'chol malchuto v'gam b'michtav limor. And Cyrus has put out this edict to all of his kingdoms, to everywhere, by word of mouth and by writing, by the written word. Second pasuk, Ko amar Koresh melech pras. This is what the king of Cyrus says, king of Persia says, Kol mamlachot haaretz natan li Hashem Elokei Hashemayim. V'hu pakad alai livnot lo beit b'Yerushalayim asher Yehuda. The Lord Hashem has given me this incredible kingdom, and he told me that I am supposed to help build the Beit HaMikdash in Judea. So first of all, we're just coming off with the view is that Hashem has inspired Cyrus to help us rebuild the Beit HaMikdash. And not just that, but Cyrus sees this as he's believing in the one Hashem. He's moved to help build the Beit HaMikdash, and he wants to be a part of that great story of the Jewish people. So this is all very exciting and very positive so far. He called out to the Jewish people in this third pasuk, Mi bachem b'kol ha'amo yi elokav imo v'ya'al Yerushalayim. Who amongst you are the Jewish people? Go to Hashem in Yerushalayim, Asher b'Yehuda, he's in Yehuda. V'yeven et Beit Hashem Elokei Yisrael. Build your house of Israel. Now again, they were exiled. They were thrown out of their home. And he's saying, return, build the home. Hashem is there for you in Yerushalayim. And he says, and if you decide not to go, you should still give some money. The fourth pasuk, V'chol hanishar mikol hamikomot asher hu garsham. Anyone who decides to stay there, yinasuhu anshe mekobo bakesef u'bezahav. They should give over to their brethren silver and gold and animals and all of these things to be a part of this great Beit HaMikdash. So not only is he saying go build the Beit HaMikdash, but he says, but if you want to stay here in my home, you should still contribute. You should still give tzedakah. And we see that some of the Jews listen. Vayakumu roshei ha'avot lihuda u'benyamin v'kohanim v'haleviim l'chol ha'ir ha'elokim et rucho la'alot, to go up, leave note, to build at Beit Hashem asher b'Yerushalayim. So many of the chiefs of these of the families of Yehuda and Binyamin, the Kohanim, the Leviim that are in the cities, they're aroused spirit to go and rebuild the Beit HaMikdash. And it says in the end, and all of their neighbors supported them. So here we have a foreign king is telling us to rebuild. He's saying that this is a feeling from Hashem, and everyone should return. And if you're not returning, you should give to the Beit HaMikdash. And not only that, but that the neighbors should contribute to what's going on. So it seems very positive and very hopeful. And it's a miracle that Hashem helped him get to this joyous day. However, as the Sefer of Ezra continues, it appears that it's not as golden age as that first chapter has us feel. First of all, the second chapter of Ezra starts off listing the people who returned. Now, we don't have to read it inside, but I brought it to you right here. It says they returned from, these are the people that were exiled from Bavel, and they returned, and here's their names. Zerubbabel, Yehoshua, Nehemiah, Sariah. Here's the list of men. The sons of Parosh, 2,172. The sons of Shephatiah, 372. And it goes on and on. I gave you just a little clip. So if they had to make a list of who's returning, then that means that a lot of people did not return. If they can say, here's the X number of people returning, it means that a lot of people didn't return. So, and we see in Zechariah, a contemporary prophet, he is, the Beit HaMikdash is in the middle of building, and he is prophesying to the people, and he's begging the people, exhorting them, Jews, please return. So if you think about what is going on in Judea, who goes back? Maybe it's people who are really inspired, and maybe it's also people who maybe didn't do so well in exile. It's the people who are saying, we can leave. We don't feel established here. We don't have huge successful businesses. We can just get up and go. Maybe that's some of the population. Some of it could be really inspired to go back to the Beit HaMikdash. Whatever it is, not all the Jews go back, and we'll see that even more so when we bring a little bit of Megillat Esther. So there's definitely a lackluster return. There's also, if we go to Ezra chapter 3, a real nostalgia and mourning over what used to be. Even when they start building the second temple, which is miraculous and wonderful and beautiful like the first chapter, the people who still lived through it, the first temple, are just distraught. It's not what it used to be. Many of the priests and the Levites, Roshei ha'avot, Zekanim, the heads of the houses and the elders of the people, Asher Ra'u et Bait Harishon, that saw the first temple, B'Yisodo, Zeh habayit be'enehem bochim b'kol gadol. Those who saw the first temple in its foundation cried the greatest cry. And some people were really, really joyous. that you had this mixture of emotions. The people who saw the Beit HaMikdash it's so painful for them. And other people are saying, we're just so happy to be back. We're here and we get to build the Beit HaMikdash again. But it was so not a minority of people who were upset that the voices got blurred. If you look at the next pasuk, the Ein Ha'am Makirim Kol Truat HaSimcha, the nation wasn't able to recognize the voice of those who were joyous, L'Kol Bechi, and the voice of the people who are crying. They're just crying and screaming, whether it was joyous or whether it was painful. They're just loud and screaming. So it's very mixed emotions on returning to the Second Temple. Other parts of Ezra, which we're not going to bring, chapter 4 talks about how enemies continue to thwart the building of the second Beit HaMikdash, that they start building it and then this enemy comes and they have to stop, and they start doing a little bit more and then this enemy comes. As you know, construction projects can take a long time. Building the second temple also hit many issues. In the 4th chapter of Ezra, people approach Ezra and say, we want to help you and we want to contribute to building the Beit HaMikdash. And Rashi in Sanhedrin says the people who approached him were actually Jews from exile, and they were idol worshippers, and that Yehoshua and Zerubbabel, the leaders of the Jewish people at the time, did not accept their donations because they said, you're Jewish people who decided to not come back, and you're idol worshippers. You are doing what we completely don't believe in, and they didn't accept their gifts. And there's even a Gemara in Erchin that says that these Jews actually were not well intended. It's not that they even wanted to contribute, that it was a ruse the whole time, and they wanted to just stop the building of the Beit HaMikdash, and they wanted to thwart the building as well. So we start to see the cracks in the story here. It's not necessarily the golden age. It's a really hard time for the Jews. They're struggling. They're trying to build this temple that's not going to be as beautiful. And additionally, in Ezra chapter 9, Ezra's whole focus is on intermarriage. How the Jews who returned, the Jews who were living in Judea and building the Beit HaMikdash, had intermarried, and he's begging them to divorce their wives, to leave these intermarriages. And some of them do. Maybe some of them, the women convert. They don't necessarily say themselves. But but later in that parak, the Jews express the sentiment that they don't view themselves as free persons. They view themselves as honored to be building the temple again, but they're not necessarily free. I want to look at another prophet, Haggai. He is one of the Nevi'im of Trei Asar. It's a very short Sefer in Nevi'im. His prophecies of Sefer Haggai span 4 months during Darius's second year in 520 BCE. The exiled Jews have returned to Israel. They have started rebuilding the temple. Haggai criticizes the people who haven't returned, but he's urging them to begin building, to keep going, to really go. And the Jewish people really listen to him. His language is very simple and straightforward, as we'll see, and his persuasion is successful. They listen to him. So many other stories in Tanakh, the Jewish people fight back and rebuke. Haggai, they really do listen to. And he even says at one point in his prophecy, 3 weeks after I started my prophecy, they listened to me. They started rebuilding the second temple. So he's very proud of himself as well. But we see from the way that Haggai addresses the Jewish people, and I kind of gave away my thesis here on top, is that we can see the Jews have a very big inferiority complex. One of them we'll see is about them being a vassal state. They're not actually independent. Another one is, what is the relationship with God? What is the divine relationship? And the third one is how modest the second Beit HaMikdash is. And that's what we're going to see, the Jews feeling all of these sentiments. So the first verse here is the pasuk 19 of chapter 1, and then it goes on to chapter 2. And it was on the 24th day of the 6th month in the 2nd year of Daryavesh the king. So first of all we know right now is that all of this is in the context of we are not our own people. We're not saying in the 40th year of the Jewish king. We're saying we are living as this vassal state. Pasuk 1 of chapter 2. Bashvi'i be'esrim ve'echad l'chodesh haya davar Hashem b'yad Chagai hanavi le'mor. What does Hashem tell Chagai, the Navi, saying? Amarna el Zerubbabel ben Shaltiel. Say it to Zerubbabel, this leader, son of Shaltiel, Hachat Yehuda, he's the leader of Yehuda, and to the head priest Yehoshua ben Yehotzadek, and to everyone else. Mi bachem hanishar asher ra'a et habayit hazeh. Who amongst you saw the first Beit HaMikdash bichvodo, in its honor? Uma atem ro'im oto, atah halo kamo ke'ein ba'einayim. How does it look to you now? It must seem like nothing in your eyes. It seems like nothing. So what's his point in saying that? Va'atah chazak, Zerubbabel. You should be strong. You should be strong. Nu'um Hashem. Those are the words of Hashem. V'chazak Yehoshua ben Yotzadek, hakohen hagadol. Yehoshua, who's a great gadol, you should be strong. V'chazak kol ha'am ha'aretz, and the whole nation should be strong. Nu'um Hashem. These are the words of Hashem. Hashem himself is saying, you should be strong. I know you feel this way, that you feel that it's not as great of a temple, but you should be strong. Why? Ki ani itchem, because I am with you. Nu'um Hashem Tzivakot. This is the words of Hashem, the God of hosts. He's saying, I am with you. What is the Beit HaMikdash worth? It's a home for me. It's not about the gold, and it's not about the pomp and circumstance. It's a home that you have created for me, and I, Hashem, love you, and I'm here for you. And he continues saying that I'm the same Hashem that brought the Jews out of Mitzrayim. At davar asher karati etchem b'tzeitchem miMitzrayim, I promised you when I came out of Egypt. V'ruchei omedet betocho al tariu. My spirit was among you then. Fear not. Don't be scared. So clearly, the people are scared. Clearly, the people are feeling that their Beit HaMikdash is not as nice. And they're also wondering, what is our relationship with Hashem? All of the prophecies leading up to the first temple, and then in the middle, leading up to the second temple, are all the prophets saying, you have to do better. Hashem's going to exile you. They were exiled. So what did they learn? We have a terrible relationship with Hashem. He's really unhappy. So here Hashem is trying to overcompensate and say, I believe in you. I love you. Come back. Build the Beit HaMikdash. Whatever it looks like, it's going to be my home. We have that connection together. We also see that, and what's very interesting about Chagai is we saw that the elders were crying over the first Beit HaMikdash. So in Sefer Chagai, he also criticizes the elders, and he says, how much their crying has affected everyone else, which is another interesting twist for Chagai. So for Chagai, everything seems to be falling into place. The people start listening to him. He usually prophetic rebuke is met with very stiff resistance, but they actually start building the Beit HaMikdash. And but we see that the Jews feel this incredible inferiority complex about being a vassal state and not being autonomous, not having the gorgeous Beit HaMikdash, and not necessarily having that direct connection with Hashem that they used to. Another sefer that we're going to look at in a little bit is Zechariah. So I'm just going to mention it here because he's a contemporary of Chagai. His Sfarim take place during the same reign of Darius II, Darius the Great, and his Sfarim date from the same time as Chagai, 520 BCE until 518 BCE. Chapters 1 through 6 recall the nation's history for the purpose of presenting to them this solemn warning of don't do what past generations did. We're rebuilding the Beit HaMikdash. Learn from them. Stick to the same path is what they do. Zechariah's visions are very unclear to us. They're very esoteric. Their dreams, we're not exactly sure what they mean. Commentaries go on and on trying to interpret these somewhat beautiful, somewhat muddled visions because we can't fully understand. And commentators actually understood the muddled and unclear visions of Zechariah to actually be significant in showing us how the Zechariah had an impaired prophecy. Maimonides in the Guide of the Perplexed said Zechariah had the lowest level of prophecy, and that's why his prophecies were so muddled. And Ibn Ezra and Radak assume that the exile and the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash really did impair prophecy in general. And that's reflected in Zechariah. But another sefer that we're going to get to right now is Megillat Esther. This one doesn't really need an introduction. We know this one pretty well. It's the story of Esther, and we read it on Purim. And yet, now put the story of Esther in the context of everything we've talked about before. We've talked about the Jews having their own state and having the Beit HaMikdash, and then having the northern kingdom get fractured. And then the Beit HaMikdash is destroyed and the Jewish people leave. The Jewish people are given permission to go back and build the Beit HaMikdash, and only some of them do. Other people stay out. Other people are intermarrying. Other people serve idols. Other people are establishing Jewish lives, but not in Yerushalayim, not in the Second Temple. And that's the whole context that Megillat Esther exists in. Megillat Esther focuses on the Jews who didn't go back. It focuses on the Jews who stayed in Persia. The historical context fits perfectly into what we've talked about with Ezra and Zechariah and Malachi. So if Achashverosh is Xerxes, then Purim's story happened sometime between 483 and 473 BCE. The Second Temple is standing because it was completed in 516 BCE. And at first glance, Esther's story is not just a story of this triumphant Jewish community, but we see, and that's the heading here, the vulnerability of the Jewish community because they were so dependent on the Persian Empire. Chapter 1, if chapter 1 is setting the story for Esther, the whole chapter 1 is about how Vashti is deposed and Achashverosh needs to find a new wife, and he finds Queen Esther. That should take a couple of psukim, but instead, Esther goes into great detail. The first chapter of Esther, Megillat Esther goes into great detail, talking about the kingdom, the beautiful, glorious kingdom of Achashverosh in a lot of detail. Vayhi b'yemei Achashverosh, hu Achashverosh, hamelach mehodu v'ad Kush. It wasn't David Achashverosh, it was the great king Achashverosh. He was the king from Hodu until Kush, Sheva v'asrim me'ah medina, 127 provinces. He was a powerful man. It was when he was living in that capital city of all of these 127 provinces. In that year, he sends out this decree to no fewer than 180. And he wants to display the riches of his vast kingdom. This is verse 4. This is the top of page 4, verse 4. He displays the vast riches of his kingdom and the splendid glory of his majesty. And he has this elaborate feast. So I just want to go, so that's where, and he was this king of all these other nations. From the great to the small, Shiva Yamim, 7-day feast. Everyone from high and low. And then look at, we'll just read the English here. There were hangings of white cotton and blue wool caught by cords of fine linen and purple wool. Royal wine was served in abundance as befits the king in golden beakers of varied design. So the emphasis on Achashverosh's royal and luxurious home is not necessarily just to say, and therefore Vashti rejected it and we needed to appoint a new queen. It's imprinting on our brains here how to view the whole period of this is Achashverosh, who was king of all of these provinces with this incredible wealth, and everyone's paying homage to him. And the Jewish people are this tiny little vassal state in Judea doing their own thing over there, and no part of our story has to do anything with that, because we're just going to focus on the Jews that stayed in this incredible kingdom of Achashverosh. Wrong distant king. So that's just kind of the first setting of Esther. This is not necessarily the story of Esther. This is a story of the dependent Jewish community on Persia. The also interesting thing is that this is how the Sefer starts. The Sefer ends this way as well. The Sefer doesn't end with, and Esther and Mordechai saved the Jewish people. It ends with, and Achashverosh was the king of all of these provinces, and his story was great, and all of these things were incredible in his Persian kingdom. Later, when we don't have it inside, but later in Megillat Esther, Esther and Mordechai and Haman all completely depend on the goodwill of the king. They're terrified to even ask him a favor. And even in all the way in Perek 8, when Haman's already deposed, he's already taken out of the picture, Mordechai and Esther have to grovel to the king. They're terrified to ask the king about saving the Jewish people of Persia. So the whole story of Esther, while it is an incredible story, is a story of Jews in exile because they're not independent. They're dependent on the people around them. They're not under their own authority, which also reflects what the other Nevi'im have portrayed, that the Jewish people feel this vulnerability, that they are just a vassal state and that they are not independent. And we see the Jews are everywhere. They're not just in Israel, even though we have the second Beit HaMikdash, they're spread out far and wide. Hashem's absence from the text, which is talked about a lot in Megillat Esther and on Purim, reflects Zechariah's reality as well. How we said Zechariah's visions are muddled and they're not clear. Hashem's not overtly in the story of Purim. Of course, we say Hashem's pulling the strings behind the scenes, but it's not actually in the Megillah. And then we have an interesting Gemara here. I'm looking at the time. Oh my gosh, we got to move a little bit. We have an interesting Gemara here that asks the question about why we don't say Hallel on Purim. I'll just do it out of the sources, but you have it here. We have Hallel on Pesach, and the first opinion from the Gemara says, oh, well, Purim didn't happen in Israel. We're like, well, neither did Pesach. Pesach was in Egypt. And so then it says, we didn't do it because they were still of the Achashverosh. They were still slaves of Achashverosh. They were still part of that slave, but they were still part of his state, and therefore not independent. And therefore, we don't say Hallel, the full Hallel. So that is the Second Temple times. Second Temple times are a wonderful period of return, but also really not a golden age. It's an age where the Jewish people are fractured. It's an age where not all of the Jews are there. They're spread out. And there's also a lot of religious contention of Jews keeping religion, not keeping religion, intermarrying, idol worshiping. It's really a fraught time leading up to the Churban. Now, the story of the Tanakh ends before the destruction of the temple, and that's where Josephus's record is incredibly important. Titus Flavius Josephus was born in 36 to 100 CE. He was actually born Yosef ben Matityahu, and he was the first century Jewish historian who was so important to our text. Christians also use his text as well, just in terms of preserving history. He was a member, from the father's side of the Kohanim, and of his mother's side of royal descent of the Hasmonean dynasty, the Hashmonaim. He was educated in Jerusalem. He most likely shared the ideology of the Prishim of the Pharisees, which is the main tenet of Judaism. But he actually really interestingly spent time in Sadducees and the Essenes just to kind of understand the different sects and the intra-Jewish fighting. But what we're going to focus on, he's got tons of incredible work. It's all on Google. His account of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. I only brought some of it. I am going to give a trigger warning here. Some of it's really, really sad and really difficult. And this is what we mourn in 9 days on Beit HaMikdash, destruction. So leading up to what I have here is the siege of Jerusalem and the drought of Jerusalem. And here we are, part 6, chapter 8. The Romans, being now become masters of the walls, they both placed their ensigns upon the towers and made joyful acclamations for the victory they had gained, as having found the end of this war much lighter than its beginning. So the Romans have conquered Jerusalem, and they put their own ensigns, their own signs on Jerusalem. For when they had gotten upon the last wall without any bloodshed, they could hardly believe what they had found to be true. But seeing nobody to oppose them, they stood in doubt with such an unusual solitude could mean. The Romans have gotten through Jerusalem, and it's quiet. No one's fighting them, and they're confused. But when they went in numbers into the lanes of the city, with their swords drawn, they're ready for a fight. They slew those whom they overtook without mercy. There were a couple of stragglers. They killed them along the way. They set fire to their houses where the Jews were fled. They burnt every soul on them, so people died alive and were burned alive. They laid waste a great many of the rest, and whoever else they killed. And when they came to some of the houses to plunder them, they wanted to steal from them and see what they could plunder. They found in them entire families of dead men, the upper rooms full of dead corpses. That is of such as died by the famine, that the famine was so bad that whole families died in their homes and weren't able to survive. The Romans are so horrified by this. They then stood in horror at this sight and went out without touching anything. They're so shocked that they leave the homes untouched. But though they had commiseration for such as were destroyed in that manner, yet they had not the same for those that were still alive. But they ran everyone through whom they met with, and obstructed the very lanes with their dead bodies, and made the whole city run down with blood to such a degree that the fire of the houses were quenched with these men's blood. So on the one hand, they were so horrified by finding all of these dead people who had died of starvation. And on the other hand, anyone else who remained, they murdered so brutally that their blood quenched the fire that they had also started. So it truly just, truly a gut-wrenching depiction of the Jewish people in such a low time. And truly so it happened that those slayers left off that even, so I'm going to skip ahead here to save some time. It goes on to say, and now since the soldiers were, this is the top of chapter 9, and now since the soldiers were already quite tired of killing men, they appear to be vast multitudes still remaining alive. And that's when Caesar comes in and says, the able-bodied people who can actually serve us, keep them alive, everyone else kill. But then they also enslaved people, and they took the women captive. And these were just the people who were able-bodied. They killed a lot of the elderly and the sick, who they found. Now, as soon as this is the top of part 1, chapter 7, part 7, chapter 1, what happens to Jerusalem? They've taken care of the Jewish people. Most of them have been murdered, either through famine or fire or bloodshed. They have taken captive a lot of them into slavery. Now, as soon as the army has no more people to slay or to plunder, because there remain none to be the objects of their fury, for they spared none, Caesar gave orders that they should now demolish the entire city and temple, but should leave as many of the towers standing as were the greatest eminency. And then to skip forward, the wall was spared, that's the western wall, in order to afford a camp for such as were to lie in garrison, as were the towers were spared as well. But for the rest of the wall, it was thoroughly laid, even with the ground, by those that dug it up to the foundation, that there was nothing left to make those that came there believe it had ever been inhabited. Jerusalem, after the people were taken care of, was so leveled that you wouldn't have believed that this was a thriving, beautiful, magnificent city beforehand. That is what you have left. If you ever do one of those tours of the old city, right next to the Western Wall, the Kotel, they have these huge stones that the Romans had partially destroyed. And you see it, it's just a pile of those stones that goes back 2,000 years. This is just a small bit of the destruction. There's a lot more detailed description from Josephus. But it was just this horrible, horrible depiction. Now, through the destruction of the temple, the Jewish people have been kicked out of their land. Even their last attempt, the Bar Kokhba revolt, which is like that last source of hope, was completely squashed. Everyone's taken, whoever has survived is taken into slaves. And not only that, but once the Jews were exiled out of Israel, they are forbidden from entering Jerusalem under orders of the Romans. And the Roman emperor at the time, Hadrian, literally wipes off the name of Israel off the map, calling it Palestina. So just trying to erase the memory of Judea and ancient Israel from history altogether. In a vacuum, this is not a people that should have survived. This is not a people against all logic and reason. We're here having a Zoom talking about it, which is incredible. How are we still here? And I think the answer to that is the last part of this lecture, which is the transition of Judaism from a temple-centric Judaism to rabbinic Judaism to what we live today. And it started all the way back with our Nevi'im, even when we had the Beit HaMikdash. So the first one I want to focus on is Zechariah. The Jewish people start turning to the prophets, not just for their prophecies, but also for their halachic and rabbinic guidance. And here's an example from Zechariah. They pose this halachic question to him. I'm going to do it out of book because out of the sources because of the time, but you have it right here. So the halachic question posed here is, do we still fast for the first Beit HaMikdash? By this point, they've already established Shiva Asar B'Tammuz and Tisha B'Av Do we fast mourning the Beit HaMikdash? We now have the Beit HaMikdash again. Do we still mourn? And the answer he gives is kind of left up to interpretation. Zechariah, the answer over here, it says here is the answer. Kol Amar Hashem Tzavakot, Som HaRevi'i, the 4th month fast. V'Yom HaChamishi, V'Tzom HaShvi'i, V'Tzom HaSiri, all of the different fasts that we still do today for the Beit HaMikdash. Lebeit Yehuda l'sason u'lisimcha. They are going to become days of joy and gladness. U'lamoadim tovim, and wonderful holidays. V'ha'emet v'hashalom avahu. And it ends with, but you must love honesty and integrity. So there's a total debate amongst the commentators as to whether they are supposed to be, what this means. Either this could mean, well, let's go back to the question, first of all. The question could be practical. The question is saying, we have a Beit HaMikdash, so do we still fast for the first Beit HaMikdash? But it also could be conceptual of, is this the redemption? It doesn't necessarily feel like the redemption. There's just a little bit of Jews who returned. There's a lot of inter-Jewish fighting. A lot of Jews aren't keeping halacha. A lot of Jews aren't living here anymore. Do we still fast because there's going to be even more of a salvation to come? Or is this the beginning of it? And so conceptually, the Jews are saying, where are we? What's our relationship with God? What is our relationship as the Jewish people? And the answer is ambiguous. Hashem saying all of these fasts are going to turn into joyous holidays. The commentators debate as to whether they actually, what the halachic answer was at the time. So much of Zechariah's point was that it's kind of yet to be written. He was saying to the Jewish people, don't make the same mistakes as your ancestors. You have to prove that you are going to follow Hashem. You're going to follow his ways. I think whether or not they fasted or not, I think it just reflects they were so traumatized by the exile and the destruction, and they're still totally unsure of their relationship with Hashem. But they were starting to pose those halachic questions. There's also a reminder and a refocusing on what's truly valued. You don't have the glorious Beit HaMikdash anymore. We can't do all of the sacrifices, and we don't have the Aron. But here we have Malachi. Malachi is the last book of the Nevi'im. According to rabbinic tradition, he marks the end of prophecy in Israel. And Malachi is reminding the Jewish people in these, again, I'm going to do it outside the sources. Malachi is reminding the Jewish people in this first paragraph what's truly valued. The ideal mission for the Jewish people is that the Kohanim are supposed to be the teachers of Israel. The Kohanim are supposed to tell them how we are supposed to behave with honesty and with integrity. And then the Jewish people are supposed to be the bridge, once they learn that from the Kohanim, between Hashem and humanity. I'm gonna try here, over here, but you've turned, he said, but you've turned away from that. Meaning, again, the focus is not about the Beit HaMikdash here at all, but it's about being good people and teaching that to others. And here we see it's the very last prophecy of Malachi. It's not, the very last prophecy is telling the Jewish people to hold on to the Torah. It's not about Beit HaMikdash. It's not about even Yerushalayim. It's about what's going to hold you as a Jewish people, and it's the Torah, it's halacha. Zichru, this is the very last pasuk. Zichru Torat Moshe, Avdi. Remember, be mindful of the Torah of Moshe, my servant. Asher tziviti oto b'chorev al kol Yisrael. I commanded him at Horeb, which was Har Sinai, over all of Israel, chukim u'mishpatim. I told him all of these laws and all of these rules of Israel. You want to know what's going to keep the Jewish people? It's the Torah, it's halacha, it's our way of life. Even in exile, even without the Beit HaMikdash, even without a land, what people are still a people without a land? The Jewish people, because we have the Torah. Wherever we go, we have the Torah that connects us. And that's what the Malviv comments here. Zichru Tor Moshe, ba'asher b'divarav, with these words, Ela chatam hanavi. This is how the prophecy is sealed. V'hi hanivuah ha'achrona. This was the last nevuah. Sha'acharav lo yinaveh od. No one else prophesied anymore. V'od navi v'choza ad ha'ketz, until the end of time. Hodia lahem. You should know. Shmata lo yikavu od lahasig davar Hashem b'nevuah. You're not going to hear Hashem's words through nevuah anymore. Rak yizkuru Torat Moshe. You should remember the Torah of Moshe, la'asot kol hakatuv ba, v'hi Torah et asher ya'asu. Everything's written there, and that's how you behave. That's how you follow the way of Hashem. It's in the Torah. And sure enough, all of these prophecies of the Jews to follow the Torah is added into Pirkei Avot. So Pirkei Avot over here, this top one on the last page, this top one talks about what is the transmission of Torah. Moshe kibel Torah misina, that Moshe got it from Sinai, and Moshe gave it to Yoshua, who gave it to the Zakanim, who gave it to the Nevi'im, who gave it to the Anshe Knesset Hagadola. But there's a fascinating Avot to Rabbi Natan, and I'll just go down to the bolded part, where he says Yehoshua gave it to the Zakanim, and the Zakanim to the Nevi'im. Chagai, Zechariah, and Malachi kiblu me Nevi'im. He adds this gap that the Nevi'im gave it to Chagai, Zechariah, and Malachi, because those were the Nevi'im that understood we have to start teaching the halacha. It's not just about prophesying, but it's about giving over the Torah as a way of connecting to Hashem. And then they gave it to the Anshe Knesset HaGedola. Just to end on this point, Rabbi, there's two books if anyone's more interested in more of this. Rabbi Chaim Angel wrote about Chagai, Zechariah, and Malachi. It's a fabulous book that goes through their Sfarim. And he says a beautiful line. He says, although the decline of revelation distanced people from the ability to ascertain God's will, it simultaneously empowered humans to participate in the mutual covenant between Hashem and humanity. There's a very famous Gemara about the Tanur Shel Achnai, that the elders, after the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, and they're in Yavna, and they're deciding about whether this oven is kosher or not, and the disagreement between the two parties ends with one of the sages being so adamant that he's the correct rabbi, that he has the correct opinion, that he says, if halacha is like me, the river is going to flow backwards. And the river flows backwards, but the rest of the people say, no, we don't agree with you. He says, if the halacha is like me, the carob tree is going to fly across the river. And the carob tree flies across the river, but the rest of the chachamim say, no, we still don't think you're correct. And he says, if the halacha is like me, a bakol is going to come out and say the halacha is like me. The bakol comes out and says the halacha is like me. And still the chachamim say, we voted and we don't think you're correct. And the answer, he says, is Rabbi Yoshua al Raglav. Rabbi Yoshua stands on his legs and he says, Torah lo b'shamayim hi. The Torah is not in the heavens. We don't get prophecy anymore. Hashem gave us the authority as Chazal to set forth halacha, and that's how halacha now works. We don't ask God, and we don't get direct divination from him. We say, this is what we have to decide as the Jewish people as the way going forward. Fascinating epilogue to the story is that Eliyahu Hanavi approaches God and he's like, Hashem, how do you feel about how this went down? What do you think? And it says that Hashem starts laughing and says, Nitzchuni b'ni, that my children have succeeded me. My children have been successful over me. That they've defeated me. And he laughs with joy, the Gemara says. This is how it's supposed to be. The Torah is lo b'shamayim. It's not something unattainable. It's for every single Jew to make the Torah theirs. Rabbi Soloveitchik, I'll end with Rabbi Soloveitchik's quote: neither ritual decisions nor political leadership constitute the main task of halachic man. Far from it. The actualization of ideals of justice and righteousness is that pillar of fire which halachic man follows when he, as a rabbi and teacher in Israel, serves his community. Halacha is supposed to teach us how to be a mensch. Halacha is supposed to teach us how to be honest and just and righteous. That's the point of halacha. And that's truly what everything comes down to. So following the Torah and following halacha is about making us good people, and that's truly what has linked us and has helped us survive for 2,000 years. And kind of making it full circle, when we go back to the Beit HaMikdash being destroyed for Sinat Chinam and being destroyed for interfighting, it goes back to, again, it's not about, of course we want the Beit HaMikdash. Of course we want to be able to serve Hashem in the Beit HaMikdash in Israel. But at the core of it, it's about being just to each other and honest and thoughtful with each other. And that halacha and hopefully leading a Torah life leads us to that place as a person. I really, really enjoy going over these Sfarim because I felt like I have learned them before, but not in this context. And I kind of felt like it brought a lot of the people of the times to life, and it brought a lot, we say everything's so complicated now. Things are complicated then too. And we can hopefully turn to the Torah for that lighting and guidance. I'll turn off the record, but if anyone wants to share any thoughts. Oh, stop share, and then also stop the record.